Hi, I'm Greg Rizzolo, editor-in-chief at JAPA, and in this video series, you'll see some of our top authors discussing their papers and the ideas that matter most to psychoanalysis today. You'll see me doing the interviews, but you'll also see our social media interns, undergraduates, grad students, and advanced candidates in psychoanalytic training, bringing the questions that occur to them and which suggest the interests of the future of our field. I hope you enjoy the series. Welcome and hello. I'm here with Donnel Stern, author of Interpretation, Voice of the Field from 2023 and Training and Supervising Analyst at the William Alanson White Institute, familiar to most of our readers and viewers as one of the most prominent interpersonal relational authors in the field. And many of us have been following his work since his early paper. I believe it was 1983, but correct me if I'm wrong, Don, on
That's
unformulated experience.
right.
That's right. So it's really interesting to read this paper and to see how your work has evolved since then. The essence of this paper, just to summarize for people who haven't read it, is that, as you write, the most memorable moments in psychoanalytic treatment are seldom the contents of the analyst's interpretations, but the feelings of being understood. Interpretations are most meaningful, not because of what they say, but because each one is evidence that the analyst, who generally becomes someone of significance to the patient, knows the patient more than before the interpretation was made. As a result of this process of witnessing, patients not only know and feel, they also know that they know and feel. They can feel their roles in authoring their experience. We're going to go through the paper and I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about it. But first, could you say something about why you wrote this paper, what the problem was that you were grappling with that inspired you to take it on in the first place?
Well, sure. You know, I don't know that I would have written a paper about interpretation were it not for the fact that there was an invitation tendered to me by the editor before you, Mitch Wilson of JAPA. For his last issue, Mitch wanted to do a symposium on interpretation, and he asked, I don't know, 4 or 5 people to write papers. I was one of them. So that's what actually determined that I would write about interpretation. Now, Mitch had a reason, though, for asking me, because he knew that I have a particular view of interpretation, which I've been writing about since I think a paper in 2009 called Partners in Thought. From that point of view, what I have said is that interpretations are really the signposts or the landmarks that the important changes have already taken place. And what I mean by that is that the interpersonal field needs to shift in a way the analyst to be capable of saying something or feeling something or thinking something that they couldn't think before, just like the patient. The patient, of course, that's true for too. So when the analyst makes an interpretation, that idea was, it is the sign that that shift in the field, which is the important thing that made this new experience possible, has taken place already. So he knew that that was my view, and I think that was why he asked me to write this. And I took the opportunity to start with this idea and then expand upon it a little bit.
Thank you for that. And what I'm going to do is go through the paper and ask questions that I had as I read it, and that hopefully resonate with questions that readers will have, or for people who haven't read the paper might inspire you to take a look. So
Sure.
you write first that you'll argue that the most precious analytic moments, as I've said a moment ago, have to do with feeling understood. And when this happens, interpretation is working not by making the unconscious conscious, sort of in sort of Freud's very early conception of therapeutic action, but by widening or deepening the patient's sense of being known and recognized by someone who's become emotionally significant, which is a process that you call witnessing. And so a lot of my questions are going to be about that process called witnessing. So could you say first how you understand witnessing and what goes into it?
Well, I think I need to slip something in under what you've said so far, which is
Please.
that we need to give primacy to the significance of, in this view anyway, of the interpersonal field. I'm going to repeat myself a little bit about what I said just a moment ago, but I hope not too much. What I want to say is that the way I understand conscious experience, the possibilities for conscious experience for both the analyst and the patient depend upon the particular configuration that's active at the moment of the interpersonal field they're creating between them. So what that means is, if you are going to want to encourage a broader range of thought or feeling, broader or deeper, than has been there before, you have to loosen the frozen places or the rigidities of the nature of the analytic relatedness, what's going on between these two people. That's the way that new experience comes about. So let's now that I've sort of slipped that under, let me go back to your question. Just remind me, what was the last part of it?
I was asking if you could say more about how you understand witnessing in that field context.
Okay. So for me, witnessing is something that starts early in life, is really an important part of what results in the possibility for a person being a particular individual, a certain human being, and with all the feelings they have about being that particular human being. Witnessing means seeing yourself through your imagination of somebody else's eyes and ears. That's the most basic definition of it.
So really, it is classically what we would call an intrapsychic phenomenon, witnessing oneself.
No, not at all. An
Okay.
interpersonal phenomenon. It means hearing yourself through what you imagine to be someone else's ears. So
Where there really is a someone else there who matters in the equation, though.
to begin with, there is. As time passes, that happens also internally between different parts of himself. Internalization as a result of the internalization of the, of the parents who begin as real people. But, one of the things I can remember writing about in the past was, if you have kids, you've had the experience of putting them in their cribs, and then you listen to them from outside their door quite often, because if you go in, they're going to want to stand up and get out of the crib. But you listen to them babbling away and then later talking. And what they're doing, it seems to me, and I'm not alone in this, is that they are consolidating their experience of the day through talking to their imagination of their parents. That's who's important. That's who it would make sense for them to be talking to. And that is that's the way that witnessing begins in a concrete sense. It becomes then something that goes on both internally and externally. It has to go on externally in psychoanalysis, though, because, well, that's a long story, but dissociation means that the way I use this term means that the self state that needs to be witnessed cannot be reached by the self state that could provide the witnessing in the inner world. That's what that's one way of dissociation is. And so for a person who in that situation, they not only, the way I've put it in another paper is, they not only can use an analyst, they need an analyst. What they need is to be able to see themselves and hear themselves through their imagination of the analyst's eyes and ears. So when you've been on a couch yourself, as many of your listeners will have been or are, you know that you are, it will be a familiar thought to you that you are, as you're speaking, you're not simply letting things out. You are speaking to your analyst, whether you're on the couch or in a chair. You're speaking to your analyst, and you are imagining what it is like for your analyst to hear you speaking these things to them. And that experience is the heart of treatment, as far as I'm concerned. And what happens as a result of that immersion in the imagination of someone else someone who cares about what you think and how you feel, listens to you, it's the heart of the matter.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions to that. I think this is a good place for something you actually get to later in the paper, which is that there are, in your conception, there's still such a thing as the individual conscious of each participant, or the individual conscious and unconscious of each participant. And so each person can have their own dissociations or other defenses. And then they come together, and now there's not only sort of an individual defensive structure going on, there's something, maybe a dissociative structure of the field. I'm not quite sure how you would phrase it, but for witnessing to occur, the field has to open in a way that is also opening for the individual psyches. Can you say more about how this all fits
I'm not
together?
sure I can. That's not exactly
Okay,
my way of thinking about it.
please, yeah, rephrase it or reframe it completely. But how does it,
Well, I don't think that the individual, you're thinking of a metaphor that I adopted from Pharaoh.
okay,
In
that's
this
right.
paper.
I think so.
It is, yes. And Bromberg writes something that's not dissimilar to this, but it was mainly from Pharaoh. And what Pharaoh says is, see, Pharaoh has a very different notion of the field than I do. I won't go into what it is because we don't have that kind of time, but it's based on unconscious fantasy, and he thinks of the fantasy between the two people as not necessarily being entirely a construction of the individual people who are involved in creating it. There's no, for example, there's no concept of enactment in his form of field theory, which is because the analyst is not involved fully as a participating human being in the same way that you are from an interpersonal or relational perspective. Witnessing is prevented when the self state that could observe the self state of oneself or the other cannot, because there's a break in the awareness of those self states of one another. And so one of the things that has to happen, and this is not in this paper but another one of the things that has to happen in order for witnessing to take place is the analyst has to, if they've lost track of it for one reason or another, including dissociation, has to regain the capacity to observe their own involvement in the situation, and then can be of use to that in that way to the patient.
That's helpful. I found the line that I was referring to, which was, as you said, around your discussion of Pharaoh. Here's what you say. You say, I don't want to be misunderstood to be attempting to do away with the individual unconscious. The field is not a substitute for the individual unconscious, but a supplement to it. And so that's what I was trying to get you to say more about, is how does the individual unconscious with its
Yeah.
dissociated content come into intersect with the field?
Well, frankly, I was a little uncomfortable with that line.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
and what I would say about it is that it skates on the edge of differentiating too much between an individual and the field. I don't
I
think of
see.
them as separate things. I don't.
Okay.
The individual is always involved in the field, but the field is something that has a social aspect. What I was trying to refer to is the historical past and the character and all that sort of thing that a person brings with them to a situation. I don't mean
Mhm.
doing away with individuality in that sense of the individual mind, but the clinical events that are meaningful to me take place. They can't be thought of as separate from the field.
Right, got it. It's not like separate circles, but in the field there are two people with discrete histories. That's more the sense you mean it.
Discrete histories and discrete personalities, but the field is their interaction.
Well, so in the context of the interaction, when you talk about witnessing, it seems like two things are happening. And I'm cheating a little bit because I'm getting this from your other paper on coming into possession of oneself. and which is also the title of your recent book, where you write that witnessing involves both recognition and affirmation. So just to supplement this paper, can you elaborate that more? What is recognition? What is affirmation? How do they work together?
Affirmation and recognition, I think we are all familiar with in the sense, but I'll say what I mean by it. I mean that one feels that the other sees one in a way that one recognizes as oneself. So it is as you're listening to your analyst, or as you're I'm sorry, as you're, well, you are imaginatively listening to yourself through your analyst's ears.
Mm,
You you know, you are having an experience which, when it is going well, we call recognition, because you are imagining that the analyst is hearing what you intend the analyst to hear, and you are feeling, and you have reason to feel usually that the analyst actually is recognizing what you're saying. Affirmation is something in addition to that. Affirmation is a kind of love. It is a kind of tenderness, love, um, caring, concern, which I think, once you work with somebody for any period of, a substantial period of time, it's routine for me that I develop such feelings. And it's not that I sit and think about them or that I ever convey them to the patient, but it means that the relationship that the patient and I have is characterized and colored by that kind of affective disposition. It is, there is something about the recognition that they can hear in listening to themselves through my ears. Something about that recognition is not only a description of a truth, but affirmative. Like they're imagining that I'm feeling, it matters to me that you are who you are. And I'm hearing what you're saying as a contribution to a picture of you that I care about. Sometimes we refer to that as making a home in the analyst's mind. And that's a good description of what I have in mind.
that's helpful. And just as a sidebar to that, what do you do with the patient um, who insists on being understood or who only feels understood when you reflect back to them what you as the analyst feel is a sort of circumscribed or defensive view of themselves? So like the me, what do you do when the patient only feels recognized when you're reflecting the me to them and
The
they
me,
feel,
I mean, the me,
the good me, bad me? I'm thinking of those terms
well,
versus the not me.
me just means everything about myself that I know is myself.
Yeah, that's how I mean it too. So what do you what you must sometimes have the experience with patients where it, what they are presenting to you and wanting for you to affirm, you feel to be disingenuous and somehow a distortion of their emotional reality.
Well, I guess you do your best to find a way of saying something about it. But you can't, I mean, sometimes you can right then, sometimes you can't. But that doesn't surprise you.
No, that doesn't surprise me. I suppose what I'm trying to think through as I talk is that recognition, and one thing that you write about recognition is that it can't be defined really by the analyst. It has to be defined by the patient who's the one feeling recognized. But the patient feeling recognized could be in a manic or grandiose or otherwise defensive state where what they experience as recognition is actually a distortion of their emotional reality.
Well, I think you've just answered your own question. I wouldn't call that recognition.
That wouldn't be recognition, right? Okay. Well, I'm glad to have answered my question. Then I'll accept my answer.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that you know what we're talking about when we talk about witnessing and recognition is what goes on at moments when things are, when there's sort of what I call continuous productive unfolding, when things are going reasonably well. A lot of my work has had to do with work with enactments, which is much more in the area where you are, where you're at, where you're coming from there.
Right.
Enactments, enactments, as far as I'm concerned, have to do with dissociation, a mutual dissociation, usually on the part of both the analyst and the patient, and it's problematic. You can't just sort of recognize or affirm your way through them. That's a
Right.
whole nother subject matter. But
That's right on point though with what I meant to be asking about, because you write in your introduction to Edgar Levinson. So Edgar Levinson from Rutledge, there's the you can buy the Ambiguity of Change and the Fallacy of Understanding in a joint edition. And you have in your introduction to that book, you have one of my favorite passages of yours, which is about the way in which the narcissist pulls for interpretations that are narcissistically wounding, and or the patient who is you know afraid of being seduced pulls for interpretations that are felt as seductive, and you go through a couple of other descriptions like that. And so
but I would change your verb. I wouldn't say pulls for.
what would you use?
That's like the old idea of what's the word when the analyst or the therapist goes along with the patient, collusion. That makes it sound sort of like a collusion, and that's not the way that Levinson sees it, nor the way that I do. I see it as the analyst actually becoming what it is that the patient is afraid of creating. It is one of the effects of the way that the patient deals with the analyst. It's not just that they're pulling for something. The analyst, because of who they are,
Becomes that.
He becomes that. He responds to the influence, and so you're right, pulls for in that sense. He responds to the influence of the patient, but there is a transformation that occurs in the analyst's way of being with the patient that actually has to be acknowledged by the analyst himself.
So could we say that recognition is always complicated then by the inactive dimension of the relationship, working through it?
Absolutely. That's what there are a series of papers about recognition. The one we're talking about tonight is one in which recognition came up, but it's not even the one where it came up the most. And in those other papers, there's a good deal about the interruption of recognition and witnessing by enactment and dissociation, and that's really the point.
The meat of the issue. Okay, that's helpful, and it's a helpful way of connecting this to the other, to the writing that I think most readers will be familiar with from you. The I just want to work my way through the paper more towards the middle here. Yeah. You point back to Strachey here on page 1128. You write that ever since Strachey's classic statement of therapeutic action as introjection of the analyst, it's been considered possible that psychic structure can be modified purely on the basis of the experienced relationship. And so really you're inserting your intervention to this literature in a tradition that goes back at least that far. The notion that interpretation is mutative for its relational effects. I think
yes,
what
I would want to add there,
yes,
is something that I know from previous discussions we've had that you also are well aware of. That what I'm trying to say though is that even though that's right, that there's a long tradition of the acknowledgement of relational effects and therapeutic action, going back to Strachey, going back, really to Ferenczi and Sullivan really were at the beginning of it too. Sullivan was not an analyst trained, and he didn't want to be known as one, but his work was made into a psychoanalysis, and he supplied all of the the raw materials. And Ferenczi, of course, we know, did that. But what I wanted to say is that in addition to the relational aspects of therapeutic action, what this paper argues, and this is where I was connecting it to what you said earlier, when we were talking before our this,
Before we press play.
yeah, is that the accuracy of the what the analyst has to say still matters.
Yes.
But it doesn't matter because of its information value. It matters because if the analyst says something and it's wrong, and if the patient doesn't feel understood by it, well, then the experience of being understood doesn't happen, and then the therapeutic action is not potentiated. If the analyst is accurate in a way that's recognized by the patient can see, oh, I see myself in what you're saying, then it seems to me that the accuracy is terribly important, but again, not because of its information value, but because it informs the patient that the analyst knows the patient and cares about the patient.
Well, so I think this is really important and will matter to readers. So I want to linger here for a moment. You write to that spirit, or in that spirit, that the content and the accuracy of the analyst's interpretive interventions are central to therapeutic action. And I think that will be a relief to people like me who do fuss a bit over whether or not what we're saying is accurate, and we want it to be accurate, and it feels like that's important somehow. And so,
Of course,
so the question is,
it wouldn't do any good just to be nice to people. I have no interest in
right,
that.
right, yeah. And so then the question is, okay, well, so how does that matter if it's not so simple as making the unconscious conscious? Because I don't think anyone or many people these days would argue that it is that simple, but how does accuracy then matter? And you go on to write, the primary reason that the content and accuracy of interpretations matter is not that they allow the revelation of unconscious content in consciousness, but rather, and I'm scrolling down to the next paragraph, they matter because they mean to the patient that the analyst knows the patient. They are the evidence most available to patients that they have a home in the analyst's mind.
Yeah.
So can you say more? So the interpretation is really in some way the evidence to the patient of a knowing that's already there, like a relational quality that's already actually there in the room.
Well, it is it is a quality that it's an aspect of the relationship, but each time that the analyst says something that the patient recognizes as being about themselves, and it can't just be recognized. I mean, I could say to somebody, well, you're selfish, aren't you? That's not going to probably help, even if it's accurate. You have to be both accurate and know the patient well enough to put it in such a way that it can be listened to.
Does the affirming come in here?
Sure.
Because the way you said that felt like it would be a put down rather than you could even call someone selfish in an endearing way that conveys care. Maybe
Oh, well,
someone could
sure.
hear that.
Sure. If that were the case, then you might have an element of affirmation involved in it. But no, I was giving it as an example of, being silly about how you don't say things to people that they can't listen to. You want, that's also part of the evidence that the patient, is that you can say things to them that are uncomfortable in a way that they can tolerate hearing. And so the other thing about affirmation that I want to say is that it should not be understood that I mean that it's, again, to use the word, I don't like the word particularly. It's not niceness. It's not about being nice. It's about being as straightforward as you can be within the limits of what the patient can live with. And it's just, in fact, the most important affirmative moments come about things the patient doesn't like about themselves, and maybe even things that the analyst doesn't particularly like about the patient. Those things, it's much more meaningful to be affirmative about. I have a patient who said, I think I quoted her in this paper, but also in another one. She said, whenever you say something that I can tell is right, it makes me feel much better. It calms me down, and it doesn't matter whether it's something good about me or something bad about me. If I can recognize it, if I know that you're talking about something that really is me, it makes me feel better.
Well, it reminds me of one of my favorite paragraphs from Melanie Klein, and I want to say that the paper is Love, Guilt, and Reparation, but I could be wrong about that. In the paragraph, she says that the person who compulsively seeks validation is someone who at heart needs his aggression to be recognized and interpreted. And until that's done, any niceness that you show him, it's like, well, you're being nice to me because you don't know how hostile I am. And, you know, in a way, it's a very empathic thing in the Cohutian language, or a very affirming thing, I think, in your vocabulary, to recognize and accept the darker aspects of the patient's experience. Would you agree with Klein in that paragraph, or would you modify it?
I have to sit and look at the paragraph, but I agree with your point.
Do you agree with the spirit of the point?
Yeah.
So this paper, just let me know if and when it does, because I want to hear it. This paper is called "The Voice of the Field," and so we have to talk about that. Um, you're essentially writing about the patient as someone who is a contributor and participates in the interpretation that he then receives from the analyst. So how does the patient participate in the interpretation or become part of the voice of the field?
Well, in fact, the way I'd put the question is even maybe different than you have. I'd say that
Sure.
what I would say is how do the patient and the analyst participate in the creation of the question? Because I think it's a joint creation. The analyst may feel as if it comes from their own mind, in fact, often does. And the patient may feel it comes from the analyst's mind too. And it does, it is true that, of course, it has to do with the analyst's intention to understand. But the degree to which the analyst can be successful in understanding, or the particular thing that comes to be understood, has everything to do with the nature of the interpersonal field that is transpiring between these two people. In the clinical example in this, which is a very brief example, what I've written about it in this paper is much longer than it took to happen, much longer, because it was really just a moment. But you can follow back any clinical moment you might want to choose. You can follow back to what the analyst was doing and how that was related to what the patient had been doing the moment before. And then what the patient was doing the moment before had something to do with what the analyst had done the moment before that, and so on. You can follow this all the way back to the first phone call the person made in trying to set up an appointment with you. The relationship, as far as I'm concerned, is the context for everything that happens within it. When the analyst can say something new, it's because the field has shifted and because something new happened between these two people for which they are both responsible. That's why I call it interpretation, the voice of the field. It is the voice of all of those influences coming together in the way we describe as interpretation. I don't particularly like that word because
Why don't you like it?
well, it suggests it has a connection to the past of a certain the analyst's omnipotence, as if the analyst could interpret the patient's mind, could know the contents of it. It doesn't have to be used that way, but it does have that kind of air to it, the connotation that it has to me. I'm considerably older than you, and when I was trained, there was an awful lot of omniscience on the part of analysts, thinking they knew what was in the patient's minds when patients didn't. I have no interest in that at all.
Well, so what I'm picturing, and I offer the metaphor to you because you know, usually when I come up with a metaphor, you correct it in some subtle way that helps me get closer to what you were actually meaning to convey. So I offer it in the spirit of please correct. But the image I get is of people playing tennis, and it's, well, why did you shoot the shot like that? And it's like, well, I shot the shot like that because you shot the shot over here from over there. Well, why did you
No,
do that? Well, because I did this. And
absolutely. That's perfectly
uh,
good. The only problem is that there's no affect in that. But if you add some, find a way of figuring out, because it's all about affect. You know,
mm,
if the tennis ball were affect, or if you somehow you were, it's an affective resonance that's moving back and forth in accompanying the conduct and the words that are being exchanged. But if you find a way of adding that, your metaphor seems fine to me.
that back and forth. One thing that you talk about in your book, Coming into Possession of Oneself, in the paper by the same name, and I think, it's in this paper as well, is something about um, what you describe elsewhere as going meta. And I'm hoping that you can clarify that. So you draw on Levinson here on page 1132, to say that even the analyst's interpretations must be understood as shaped by the very phenomena they're intended to illuminate. And there's somehow a coming into possession of how one is authoring one's own experience as one is participating. It's hard for me to capture in words, but can you say more about what does it mean to come into possession of oneself?
Yeah, it means to me that one's experience feels one is aware of authoring it. One is aware of being its author, of being the one whose experience it is. I could say of creating it, but the problem with that verb is it makes it sound a little too definite, because very seldom do we have the sense that like when you're typing a word on the computer, that's you putting that word there.
Mm,
This is this going meta process is not as definite as that. It's the difference between experiencing thoughts and feelings as just hitting you in a way that is usually without much thought being put to it, more or less passive, like they happen to us. We
mm,
we feel, we are in various ways, and we don't spend a lot of time or effort in determining that we have anything to do with it. We act on it. We go through our day that way. Analysis an opportunity to really examine and not just examine, but let yourself sink into an awareness of the degree to which you are responsible for your own experience. Now, it isn't something you can do always by choice. It happens. It happens most convincingly, I think, without our conscious intention. When I say going meta, what I mean is something like that you not only know and feel whatever it is, you know that it's you doing the knowing and the feeling. It's me.
you know this. When you know this, you don't. I don't think you mean that you know it in a
No,
conscious, reflective. I'm
not at all.
thinking about that sense, but you know it in a sense of felt knowledge.
Yeah, you grok it if you know that word. You know that
No,
word?
uh,
Well, that's once again because I'm so much older than you. Grok is a very useful word that was made up by a science fiction writer named Robert Heinlein, who wrote a book which, when I was in college, was all the rage, called "Stranger in a Strange Land." And it was a Martian who came to Earth and started a religion, and he used to refer to grasping something in a way that maybe we would say grasping the gestalt, or what Ernest Chattel would call the allocentric attitude, grasping it all together all at once. That's called grok. That's what he referred to as grokking. So you grok
you grok it.
that your experience is your own. And there are a lot of clinical examples in which well, actually, in this little clinical example in this paper, there are a lot of others that are better in this respect about this particular phenomenon. But even in this little example, Alan, the person I'm writing about, um, you know, he at a certain point, because of the kind of interaction that we had, I think, he said, well, yeah, I guess I didn't like it about my having ended the session abruptly I think it was a previous Friday. And that's a small example of becoming, yeah, it's me. I didn't like it. I made that, I'm not happy with you. It isn't just sort of a nagging feeling of dissatisfaction. It is a sense that this belongs to me. There's a kind of agentic quality to it um, that I like to call coming into possession of oneself.
And right before that moment, when he says, "Yeah, I guess that's me," he's being kind of snarky or sarcastic.
Well, he just
And,
made a little tiny laugh that had just maybe a little sardonic, or to use your word, a little snark to it. But it was only that. It was very
yeah,
very.
and in the subtlest of ways, this was a little bit of enactment contrasted with that's not coming into possession of oneself. It's doing it, but not owning it, or owning's the wrong, not avowing it as one's own feeling.
Um, well, actually, I think he was taking quite a risk, as I said in the paper.
Yes, you do say that.
Yeah, so I don't think it was an enactment, because there was, in fact, it wasn't dissociated. He
Okay.
was he was willing to reveal his feelings enough to laugh in that way that he probably, I certainly didn't think about it in so many words, but he probably would have been aware if you could ask him about it. Yeah, Dr. Stern might have been able to tell that I was a little, that wasn't altogether happy. So he was taking a risk in doing that, and that it was one of the things I said was, one of that was, if he hadn't done that, none of this would have happened. Of course, if the phone,
You would have had no basis to interpret.
yeah, well, it wouldn't have happened then anyway. It happened as a
Mm.
result of, and it happened as a result of the phone ringing. If the phone hadn't rung, these events wouldn't have taken place as they did. So as I said in the paper, contingency has a role to play too, but that's neither here nor there really. The important thing
Well,
is he behaved in a way, and I behaved in ways, both of us did, that made possible what eventually took place. And because it was the context of the two of us doing these things together, I call it the interpretation as the voice of the field.
um, it's all very helpful, and I think has hopefully piqued listeners' interests. The case that you described really captures some of these ideas, and what I'm regretting is that I didn't ask you more about the case throughout, because I think that really helps people to picture what you're saying. Um, but it's all there in the paper, and so what I'll do is encourage readers who want a really tangible example to read the paper, and this is laid out there at length. It
You know
is the
what I would,
case.
Greg, may I add to them, for them,
Yes.
this, if they happen to be interested in these things, there are several papers that lay out this paper was about interpretation. It was less, I had to get into recognition and witnessing, but those topics are covered in much more detail in a paper that came out in the quarterly, and that you've mentioned, and it's the title,
Coming into possession.
Coming into Possession of Oneself. Yeah.
Mm.
The book is called On Coming into Possession of Oneself. I think the paper is too, actually. And another one called Distance and Relation, which was in JAPA, which has a reference to a lot of these ideas too. JAPA in the last year or two, both those papers in the last year or two.
Well, so at the very end of my question, or of my questions, what I'm curious about is, what I didn't ask you. And if there's something that you're sitting around thinking, oh, I wish someone would ask me that, or what problems or questions does the paper leave you with at this point?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a good question. I think that what I would like to do eventually, it's a challenge, is to I would like to write more about what I mean by affirmation. What does analytic affirmation mean? Say more about the part that it plays, perhaps. But for the time being, I'm sort of I'm not working on anything at this particular moment. But I'm waiting until a project comes up and hits me. That's the way they generally do.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for your generosity and, being available and answering all of my questions. And, I hope that people read and they'll get a lot out of it, as I have, and as I think a lot of people have, just following your work for what is it, 40 years now? Over 40 years.
Over 40 years, yeah. Yeah, it's been a long time. I thank you, Greg, for inviting me to do this. It's been fun, and you're a good interviewer. I appreciate it.
I'll take it. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.